There's a version of you that exists only in your mind. Not the person you see in the mirror each morning, rushing through another automated routine. Not the one who answers emails with the same corporate phrases or laughs at jokes that aren't funny because everyone else is laughing. I'm talking about the person you thought you'd become when you still believed the future held something worth waiting for. That version is haunting you. Every single day. You feel it most acutely in those strange, quiet moments, waiting for coffee to brew, stuck in traffic, lying awake at 3 in the morning while your partner sleeps peacefully beside you. That hollow recognition that somehow, without noticing exactly when, you traded the person you were becoming for the person you needed to be to get by. And here's what nobody tells you about that trade: it happened so gradually that you miss the exact moment you made it. One day you're 23 with a head full of plans and energy that feels inexhaustible. You take the job that's just temporary. You postpone the trip that's been on your mind. You agree to one more obligation that doesn't align with what you actually care about. Small choices, each one reasonable, each one necessary. But choices have weight. They accumulate. And before you realize what's happened, you're 35 or 42 or 51, and the person staring back at you is a stranger wearing your face. The question isn't whether this has happened to you. If you're honest, you already know the answer. The question is, what do you do about it now? Because here's the uncomfortable truth that most motivational content won't touch: there's no dramatic comeback story waiting for you. No moment when everything clicks into place and suddenly you're living the life you imagined. That's fantasy. That's the narrative we tell ourselves to avoid the actual work of transformation, which is far less cinematic and far more demanding than any movie montage suggests. Real change doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It shows up in how you spend Tuesday afternoon. It lives in whether you choose the conversation that matters over the one that's comfortable. It exists in the gap between what you say you value and what your calendar actually reveals about your priorities. Let me tell you what I mean. You know that feeling when you're in a meeting and someone says something you disagree with, not just mildly disagree, but fundamentally, ethically disagree, and you say nothing. You nod. You smile. You participate in the collective pretending that this is fine, this is normal, this is just how things work. And the moment passes. And you tell yourself it didn't matter, it was just one meeting, there will be other chances to speak up. But there won't be. Because courage isn't a bank account where you save up moments of cowardice and then make one big withdrawal of bravery. It's a muscle. And right now, for most of us, that muscle has atrophied to the point where we can barely recognize what it feels like to use it. The same applies to every other aspect of how we've learned to diminish ourselves. The way we apologize for taking up space. The way we frame our needs as impositions. The way we've trained ourselves to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating, not because it serves us, but because it makes us easier for others to manage. And look, I understand why this happens. The world doesn't reward difficulty. Systems function smoothly when people comply. Relationships avoid friction when everyone agrees to certain unstated rules about what can and cannot be discussed. Your job runs more efficiently when you don't question the meaningless metrics or the meetings that could have been emails or the entire infrastructure of performance theater that everyone knows is absurd but nobody acknowledges. So you adapt. You learn the game. You play your part. But here's what that adaptation costs you, yourself. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic moment of selling your soul. It's quieter than that. It's the slow erosion of knowing what you actually think about things. It's the gradual loss of the ability to distinguish between what you want and what you've been conditioned to want. It's waking up one day and realizing you've become so good at performing the role that you're no longer sure there's anyone underneath it. This is the crisis that nobody prepares you for. Not the catastrophic failure. Not the public humiliation or the devastating loss. Those are terrible, yes, but they at least provide clarity. They force a reckoning. What I'm describing is worse because it asks nothing of you. It simply continues, day after day, year after year, until you can't remember what it felt like to be anything other than tired. So what's the alternative? And this is where every instinct you have is going to resist what I'm about to say, because you've been trained to expect solutions that sound inspiring. You want the answer to be something grand. Launch the business. Quit the job. Move to another country. Make the bold gesture that redefines everything. But that's not how this works. The alternative starts with something so small and so mundane that your brain will immediately dismiss it as insufficient. It starts with paying attention to the moments when you betray yourself. Not judging them. Not drowning in guilt about them. Just noticing them. When you agree to something you don't want to do, notice. When you laugh at something that isn't funny, notice. When you perform enthusiasm you don't feel, notice. When you stay silent about something that matters, notice. That's it. That's the beginning. Because you cannot change a pattern you haven't acknowledged. And most of us are so skilled at avoiding acknowledgement that we can live entire decades without confronting the simple fact that we're participating in our own diminishment. Once you start noticing, something interesting happens. Not immediately, not in a week or even a month, but gradually, you begin to see the architecture of your own constraints, the invisible agreements you've made, the boundaries you've accepted without questioning whether they serve you, the narratives you've internalized about what's possible and what's realistic and what people like you get to want from life. And here's where it gets difficult, because seeing these things creates obligation. You can't unsee them. You can't go back to the comfortable unconsciousness of just going through the motions. Once you've recognized how much of your life is constructed from compromises you never consciously agreed to, you have to decide what you're going to do about it. This is the point where most people retreat, because the alternative, actually changing things, requires something that feels almost impossible in our current moment: sustained discomfort in service of a future you can't guarantee. Think about what I'm asking you to do. I'm suggesting that you deliberately make your life harder in the short term for potential benefits that may or may not materialize in the long term. I'm asking you to have difficult conversations, to set boundaries that will upset people, to disappoint those who've grown comfortable with your compliance, to risk the stability you've worked so hard to achieve for the possibility of something more aligned with who you actually are. By every rational measure, this is a terrible idea. And yet, what's the alternative? Continue the slow fade into irrelevance in your own life? Keep performing the role until you can't remember it's a performance? Wait for some external catalyst to force the change you're too afraid to initiate yourself? Because that's the other option. And it's the one most people choose. They wait. They hope. They tell themselves that someday, when circumstances are different, when they have more time or more money or more energy, then they'll make the changes they know they need to make. But circumstances are never different. There's always a reason to wait. Always another obligation, another person to consider, another perfectly rational excuse for postponing the conversation with yourself about what you're actually doing with the one life you have. Here's what I've learned: the people who manage to break this cycle don't do it through some massive act of courage. They do it through 1,000 tiny acts of honesty. They tell the truth about small things. They honor small commitments to themselves. They make small choices that align with who they want to be rather than who they've learned to be. A small choice looks like this: someone asks you to do something you don't want to do. Your automatic response is already forming, the polite yes, the manufactured enthusiasm. But you pause, just for a second, and in that pause, you tell the truth. I'd rather not. Not with a long explanation. Not with effusive apology. Just the simple statement of your actual preference. That's it. That's the revolutionary act. And it feels ridiculous, doesn't it? It feels too small to matter. This is not the stuff of transformation. This won't get you featured in some inspirational article about people who changed their lives. But here's what that small choice does: it starts to rebuild the connection between what you feel and what you express. It begins to restore the integrity that's been fragmented by years of performing. It creates a tiny bit of space between stimulus and automatic response, and in that space, you start to remember that you have agency. You do this enough times, and something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but you start to notice that you're less exhausted, that conversations feel less like performances, that you're carrying less resentment about obligations you agreed to but never wanted, that the gap between who you are and who you present to the world is narrowing. And gradually, those small choices compound. You start making slightly larger ones. You start questioning assumptions you've held for years. You start having conversations you've been avoiding. You start removing yourself from situations that require you to be someone you're not. This is where people get scared, because removing yourself from situations that don't serve you means disappointing people. It means losing relationships that were built on your willingness to accommodate. It means accepting that some people in your life actually prefer the diminished version of you because it's easier for them to be around. That last part is brutal, but it's true. There are people in your life right now who benefit from your self-betrayal, who've grown comfortable with your tendency to put their needs above your own, who like that you don't make waves, don't ask difficult questions, don't require them to meet you at your full depth and complexity. These people will not support your growth. They'll say they do, of course. They'll use all the right language about wanting what's best for you. But watch what happens when you actually start changing. Watch how quickly support turns to concern. How your growth gets reframed as selfishness. How your boundaries get interpreted as rejection. You're going to have to choose. You're going to have to decide whether maintaining those relationships is worth continuing to diminish yourself. And there's no easy answer to that question. Sometimes the relationships are important enough that you find ways to evolve them. Sometimes they're not, and you have to let them go. But either way, you can't grow without confronting this choice. The same is true for your relationship with work, with how you spend your time, with what you've convinced yourself you have to do versus what you actually have to do versus what you want to do. Most of us have never seriously examined the difference between those three categories. We've collapsed them into one undifferentiated mass of obligation. But they're not the same. And treating them as if they are is how you end up spending decades doing things you hate for reasons you can't quite articulate when pressed. So here's an exercise that will make you uncomfortable. Take one day and track every activity. Not what you accomplished, not what was productive, just what you actually did with your time, and this is the hard part, how you felt while doing it. Not how you should feel, not how you convinced yourself you feel, how you actually felt. You're going to discover some things. You're going to find that activities you've told yourself are important drain you completely. That obligations you've accepted as necessary could actually be declined or delegated or eliminated. That you're spending significant time on things that serve no purpose beyond maintaining an image or meeting expectations that nobody actually has of you except yourself. And you're going to have to decide what to do with that information. This is where the rubber meets the road. Because knowing what needs to change and actually changing it are two very different challenges. Knowledge doesn't transform you. Action does. And action requires you to do the one thing our entire culture is designed to help you avoid, feeling uncomfortable on purpose. We are so deeply conditioned to pursue comfort, to eliminate friction, to optimize and streamline and make everything as easy as possible. And there's nothing wrong with that when applied to genuinely meaningless tasks. But we've applied that same logic to everything, including the things that actually require difficulty to have meaning. You cannot grow without discomfort. You cannot develop capacity without stress. You cannot discover what you're capable of without pushing beyond what currently feels manageable. This is true physically, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, in every dimension of development. Growth requires voluntary exposure to challenge. But we've built lives that systematically remove challenge, that protect us from discomfort, that give us the option to quit the moment something feels hard. And then we wonder why we feel so hollowed out. Why nothing seems to matter. Why we can't shake this persistent sense that we're capable of more than we're currently expressing. It's because you are. You are capable of more. Not in some vague, inspirational way. In the very specific sense that you have abilities you've never developed, capacities you've never tested, depths you've never explored because you've spent so much energy making your life comfortable that you've eliminated the conditions necessary for growth. And I know what you're thinking, but I'm already exhausted. I barely have energy for what I'm currently doing. How am I supposed to add challenge to my life? This is the wrong question. You're not adding challenge to your existing life. You're removing the things that are depleting you without providing any real value, which creates space and energy for challenges that actually matter to you. There's a massive difference between the exhaustion that comes from spending 8 hours doing work you hate and the exhaustion that comes from spending 4 hours doing something that challenges you in ways you care about. The first kind of tired drains you. The second kind builds you. But you have to be willing to make the trade. You have to be willing to give up the safety of the known, unsatisfying thing for the uncertainty of the unknown thing that might actually fulfill you. And this is terrifying. I understand that. The known misery is always easier to tolerate than the unknown possibility. At least you know what to expect. At least you've developed coping mechanisms. At least you can predict how bad it will be. Starting over, actually changing direction, actually pursuing what matters to you, means entering territory you can't map in advance. It means risking failure. It means potentially discovering that the thing you thought would fulfill you doesn't. It means confronting all the ways you might not be as capable or talented or disciplined as you've told yourself you could be if only you had the chance. So most people don't do it. They stay in the known misery. They continue the slow fade. They tell themselves they're being realistic, being responsible, being mature about their choices. But there's nothing mature about abandoning yourself. There's nothing realistic about building a life that requires you to suppress who you are. There's nothing responsible about teaching the people who matter to you, especially if you have children, that this is what adulthood looks like, quiet desperation dressed up as stability. You have permission to want more than this. You have permission to acknowledge that the life you've built isn't the life you want. You have permission to start making different choices, even if those choices disappoint people who've grown comfortable with your predictability. You don't need to blow everything up. You don't need to make some grand dramatic gesture. You just need to start telling the truth about small things and making small choices that honor what you actually value instead of what you think you should value. Start there. Start with one small act of self-honoring today. Not tomorrow. Not when circumstances are better. Today. Tell the truth about something small. Set one boundary. Decline one obligation that doesn't serve you. Spend 15 minutes on something that actually matters to you instead of something you think you should do. And then do it again tomorrow. And the next day. And the day after that. Because transformation isn't an event. It's a practice. It's the accumulation of small choices made consistently over time. It's boring. It's undramatic. It's the opposite of the inspiring narrative we've been sold about how change happens. But it works. 6 months from now, you'll look back and barely recognize the person you are today. Not because of some dramatic intervention, but because you've been making different choices every single day. Because you've been slowly, steadily closing the gap between who you are and who you've been performing. Because you've been choosing honesty over comfort, alignment over approval, growth over safety. And it will be hard. There will be days when you want to quit. When the old patterns feel easier. When disappointing yourself feels preferable to disappointing others. When you question whether any of this matters. Those days are part of the process. They don't mean you're failing. They mean you're doing something real. Keep going. Not because I'm telling you to. Not because some external authority demands it, but because you owe it to yourself to find out who you could become if you stopped settling for who you've learned to be. That version of you haunting your quiet moments. The one who remembers what it felt like to believe in your own potential. That person is still possible. Not through magic. Not through luck. Through choice. Through daily, unglamorous, difficult choice. The question is, are you willing to make those choices? Not someday. Not when it's easier. Not when you're ready. Now. Because ready is a myth. Better circumstances are a myth. The perfect moment is a myth. There's only now, and what you choose to do with it. So choose yourself. Choose honesty. Choose growth. Choose the discomfort of becoming over the comfort of remaining. And see what happens. You might surprise yourself. Let me tell you what this actually looks like in practice, because theory without application is just another way to avoid doing the work. You're going to start noticing patterns. Specifically, you're going to notice how much of your daily behavior is automated response rather than conscious choice. You reach for your phone the moment you feel bored. You say yes before you've even processed what you're agreeing to. You order the same thing, take the same route, have the same conversations with the same conclusions. This automation isn't accidental. Your brain is designed to conserve energy by creating habits and routines. And in many contexts, that's useful. You don't want to have to consciously think about how to brush your teeth or drive to work. But somewhere along the way, you automated things that should require thought. You put your aspirations on autopilot. Your values. Your boundaries. The very things that define who you are. And now you're running a program you didn't consciously write, wondering why you feel like a passenger in your own life. Here's what breaking that looks like. You're going to have to insert pauses. Intentional gaps between stimulus and response. Someone asks you to do something, pause. Before you automatically agree, before you launch into the familiar excuse-making or people-pleasing, pause. 5 seconds. Long enough to ask yourself, do I actually want to do this, or am I just doing what I always do? That pause is going to feel excruciating at first, because you've been trained to believe that hesitation is weakness. That thinking about what you want is selfish. That the considerate thing to do is immediately accommodate whatever others need from you. But that's not consideration. That's self-abandonment dressed up as virtue. Real consideration, the kind that sustains relationships instead of slowly poisoning them with resentment, requires that you know what you actually want. That you can distinguish between genuine generosity and compulsive accommodation. That you can offer authentic yes or authentic no instead of that lukewarm maybe yes that serves nobody. So you practice the pause. And in that pause, you practice honesty. Not brutal honesty. Not the kind that uses truth as a weapon. But simple, clear honesty about your actual state. I'm not available for that. That doesn't work for me. I'd prefer not to. Complete sentences. No elaborate justifications. No apologizing for existing. You do this, and you're going to get pushback. People who've benefited from your automatic yes are going to find your pause inconvenient. They're going to interpret your boundary as rejection. They're going to tell you you've changed, and they won't mean it as a compliment. They're right, though. You have changed. You've started choosing yourself. And to people who relied on you not doing that, it's going to feel like betrayal. This is where you find out what your relationships are actually built on. Some people will adjust. They'll recognize that you setting boundaries makes the relationship more honest, more sustainable. They'll appreciate that when you say yes now, it means something because they know you're capable of saying no. But others won't adjust. They'll pressure you, guilt you, try to resurrect the version of you that was easier to manage. And you're going to have to decide whether maintaining that relationship is worth reverting to patterns you've worked hard to break. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the relationship matters enough that you find ways to evolve it without sacrificing yourself. But sometimes, and this is the hard truth, the relationship was only ever functional because you were dysfunctional. And as you become healthier, it becomes unsustainable. Letting go of those relationships is grief. Real grief. Even when you know intellectually that it's the right choice, even when you can clearly see that the relationship was harming you, there's still loss. Because these people were part of your story, part of how you understood yourself. And releasing them means releasing a version of your identity. But here's what nobody tells you about that grief. On the other side of it is space. Space for relationships that don't require you to be smaller than you are. Space for people who meet you at your actual depth. Space for the kind of connection that only becomes possible when you stop pretending. The same principle applies to your relationship with work, with how you spend your time, with what you've accepted as your lot in life. You know those things you keep saying you'll do someday? The project that's been in the back of your mind for years? The skill you've always wanted to develop? The experience you keep postponing? What if someday is a lie you tell yourself to avoid the discomfort of actually pursuing those things now? Because here's the truth, if it's been someday for more than a year, it's never. You're never going to write that book. You're never going to learn that language. You're never going to take that trip. Not because you can't, but because you decided, through inaction, that you won't. And maybe that's fine. Maybe those things aren't actually important to you. Maybe they're borrowed dreams, things you think you should want because they sound impressive or because someone you admire did them. There's no shame in acknowledging that what you thought you wanted isn't what you actually want. But if they do matter, if these aren't just idle fantasies but actual expressions of who you are and who you want to become, then someday is the enemy. Someday is the lie you tell yourself so you can keep deferring the discomfort of actually doing the thing. So here's a different approach. What if you did 15 minutes today? Not an hour. Not a perfectly planned session. Just 15 minutes of actual engagement with the thing you keep postponing. But that's not enough time to make any real progress, you're thinking. And you're right. 15 minutes won't finish the novel or make you fluent in Italian or get you in shape. But 15 minutes will do something that all your years of someday haven't done. It will move you from theoretical desire to actual practice. And that shift, from thinking about doing the thing to actually doing the thing, even badly, even incompletely, changes something fundamental. It changes your identity. You're no longer someone who wants to write. You're someone who writes. Even if what you wrote is garbage. Even if you only wrote 3 sentences. You did the thing. Do it tomorrow. And the next day. And the day after that. Not because you're building toward some grand outcome, but because daily practice, even brief, even imperfect, compounds in ways that occasional heroic effort never does. This is true for anything meaningful. You don't build a relationship by saving up all your attention for one big romantic gesture. You build it through consistent small acts of presence and care. You don't develop expertise through intensive weekend workshops. You develop it through daily engagement, even when it's hard, even when you're tired, even when progress feels imperceptible. The culture tells you the opposite. It sells you the transformation story, the dramatic change, the quantum leap. And those make for good marketing, good entertainment. But they are terrible models for actual growth. Real growth is boring. It's showing up when you don't feel like it. It's doing the thing when it's not fun anymore, but you do it anyway because you've made a commitment to yourself. It's choosing the harder path not because it's dramatic but because it's aligned with who you're trying to become. And most days, nobody will notice. You won't get credit. There won't be applause. You'll just do the thing, and then you'll go to bed, and tomorrow you'll have to choose again. This is why most people quit. Not because they lack ability or resources. Because they can't tolerate the unglamorous reality of actual change. They want the outcome without the process, the destination without the journey, the transformation without the daily, tedious work of actually transforming. But you can't have that. Nobody can. The only way through is through. The only way to become different is to make different choices, repeatedly, until those choices become who you are. You're going to have setbacks. Days when you revert to old patterns. Moments when you choose comfort over growth, approval over authenticity, safety over honesty. This doesn't mean you failed. It means you're human. The question isn't whether you'll stumble. It's whether you'll get back up and keep going. And here's something important to understand: getting back up gets easier. Not because the challenges get smaller, but because you get stronger. Every time you choose yourself, you build evidence that you can survive the discomfort of choosing yourself. Every time you set a boundary, you prove to yourself that you can handle the pushback. Every time you pursue what matters instead of what's easy, you develop the capacity to keep doing it. This is how you change. Not through willpower or motivation or inspiration. Through building evidence. Through accumulating proof that the person you're trying to become is actually possible. And gradually you'll barely notice it happening, you'll look around and realize your life looks different. Not because of one big change, but because 1,000 small changes have compounded. The relationships that drain you have fallen away. The obligations that served no purpose have been eliminated. The time you used to waste on things you didn't care about is now invested in things you do. You'll notice that conversations feel different. That you're not performing as much. That you can be quiet without feeling like you need to fill the space. That you can express disagreement without needing to convince anyone. That other people's disappointment, while still uncomfortable, no longer determines your choices. You'll notice that you're less exhausted. Not because you're doing less, but because more of what you're doing is aligned with who you actually are. The energy you used to spend on maintaining contradictions, between what you feel and what you express, between what you value and what you do, is now available for actually living. You'll notice moments of something you'd almost forgotten: genuine satisfaction. Not the fake enthusiasm you've learned to perform. Not the temporary high of distraction or consumption. But the quiet, solid feeling of being exactly where you are, doing exactly what you're doing, without wishing you were somewhere else being someone else. These moments will be brief at first, quickly overwhelmed by all the noise and urgency and obligation. But they'll get longer, more frequent, more familiar, until one day you realize that this alignment between who you are and how you live isn't an occasional state you visit. It's your baseline. That's what's possible. Not through magic. Not through luck. Through choice. Through daily, unglamorous, difficult choice. The work starts now. Not when you're ready. Not when circumstances improve. Not when you've figured everything out. Now, with exactly the resources and constraints and complications you currently have. You already know what the first step is. That thing you've been avoiding. That conversation you need to have. That boundary you need to set. That obligation you need to decline. That 15 minutes you need to invest in what actually matters to you. Do it today. And then tomorrow, choose again. And the day after that, choose again. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. Just consistently, one choice at a time, one day at a time, building the life that belongs to you instead of continuing to live the life you think you're supposed to have. The haunting stops when you close the gap. When who you are and who you're becoming align. When you stop betraying yourself in small ways every single day. That version of you that exists only in your mind? It's not a fantasy. It's a possibility. And the distance between possibility and reality is measured in choices. Start choosing. Now.